The waiting room smelled like nothing. That was the first thing Sergeant Delamaro noticed when they brought her in, not the cold, not the thin hum of recycled air, not even the pale silver walls that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It was the absence of smell that unsettled her. Every waiting room she had ever sat in before, field hospitals, VA offices, the cramped corridor outside the court-martial hearing that ended her first career, had carried something. Antiseptic, old coffee, other people's fear leaking through fabric. This place had none of that. It was a room built to pretend nothing had ever happened inside it. She shifted in the chair. Her left leg ached from the knee down. It always ached now, ever since the Vicari shrapnel had taken a fist-sized chunk of muscle from her calf during the crossing at Minos Station. The surgeons had regrown it, technically. Muscle was muscle. But the body remembered absence the way the mind remembered pain, as a shape and outline, a negative space that no amount of regrowth could quite fill. There were 4 other people in the waiting room. She didn't look at them directly. She cataloged them the way she had been trained to, peripherally, efficiently, without making it a thing. A middle-aged man in a gray suit reading something on a thin tablet. His eyes moved too slowly for genuine reading. A woman in her 40s, expensively dressed, hands folded too neatly in her lap. 2 others she had already discounted, older, unwell, here for something different. Not here for what she was here for. She told herself she wasn't sure what she was here for. The brochure had arrived 6 weeks after she'd been discharged from the rehabilitation unit at Kepler Base. It wasn't addressed to her by name. It was addressed to Veteran, First Contact Theater, which was a designation she had not known anyone else used anymore. Most people called it the Death World or War now, which she found insulting in the specific way that only people who had not been there found the name romantic. She had served in the First Contact Theater for 11 years. She had killed Vicari, the large ones, with the 6-limb trunk bodies and the bioluminescent throat sacs, and the small ones with the burrowing appendages and the hive mind coordination that made them terrifying in numbers. She had also watched Vicari die in ways that made her feel things she was not prepared to feel, which was its own kind of wound, and one the brochure did not mention. The brochure said, "Connection through presence." It said, "The closest you will ever get," it said. A new kind of healing for a new kind of war. She had almost thrown it away. She had kept it instead, the way she kept certain objects from the war. Not as trophies, not as relics, but as evidence that something had actually happened to her. The woman at the front desk called her name, Sergeant Morrow, not a question. Room 7. She stood and walked through the interior door, and behind her the waiting room continued its careful, odorless silence. Room 7 was smaller than she expected. There was a padded chair, a low table, a single photograph on the wall, a field of tulips, red ones, photographed from an angle that made them look like they were leaning towards something off-frame. One of the tulips in the foreground was bent almost to breaking. Its stem curved at a wrong angle, and she couldn't tell if it had been photographed that way by accident or intention. A man was already seated across the table. He looked around 40, with the kind of lean that came from the war and not from fitness. The kind of lean that was really emptiness. A person wearing themselves like a suit 2 sizes too big. His hands rested on the table, and she saw the small silver port on the inside of his left wrist, the standard issue BioLink all First Contact veterans carried. She had one too. "Surgeon," he said. "What are you?" she said, not rudely, just directly. He almost smiled. "My name is Dr. Arncellis. I'm a neural transfer specialist. What I am, specifically, is whatever makes this work easier for you to understand." He opened a thin case on the table and removed 2 small devices, each the size and shape of an old coin. "You read the brochure, parts of it. The parts that brought you here." She sat down. "The part that said you can transfer recorded biological impressions." That's what it said. "Biological impressions from," she stopped. "From Vicari," he said. He didn't flinch saying it. She appreciated that. "You have recordings," she said, "of their biology. We have something more specific than that." He set one of the coin devices in front of her. It was warm to the touch. She could tell even from a foot away the faint infrared shimmer of stored biometric data, compressed into something that could dock with the BioLink port. "We have 11 years of collected Vicari biological data, sensory impressions, chemical signatures, the things their bodies put into the world that human senses can't normally receive, processed, filtered, adapted for human neurology." He paused. "The experience of being briefly in the presence of a Vicari. Not the war, not the violence. The other thing." She was quiet for a moment. "Why would anyone want that?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. "You tell me," he said. "You're here." She looked at the photograph on the wall, the bent tulip, the field of flowers leaning towards something absent. "I want to understand," she said finally, "what they were." Not what we made them into and not what they made us into, what they actually were. Celis nodded slowly, as if she had confirmed something he had been waiting to hear. That's the most honest answer I've had in 6 months, he said. He slid the coin across the table toward her. This is the most recent compilation. Most of our clients use it once and say it was like dreaming. He paused. A few come back. Which kind are you expecting me to be? He looked at her with careful, neutral eyes. I genuinely don't know, he said. Which is also why you're interesting. She picked up the coin. It was warmer than she'd expected. She did not use it that day. She carried it home to the small apartment she rented on the east side of Kepler City, the part of town that still had cracked sidewalks and a view of the freight yards, which she preferred to the newer neighborhoods with their clean lines and their deliberate forgetting. She set it on the kitchen table next to a cold cup of coffee and looked at it for a while. The apartment had one personal photograph on the wall, her and Corporal Yusuf Ari, taken 6 months before Minos Station, both of them squinting into a sun that existed on a planet she could not name in front of witnesses. They were laughing in the photograph. She couldn't remember what at. She remembered the sun, the specific weight of the light on Yusuf's face, the way he laughed from somewhere deep and genuine, and she remembered that 3 weeks later he had died in a tunnel under Minos Station with Vakari biochemical scarring across 70% of his body, which was a death that had taken 18 hours to complete. She picked up the coin. She set it down. She went to sleep and dreamed about the tunnel. She went back to the clinic on a Thursday, which was 3 weeks later, which she chose to interpret as not being particularly significant. It was raining. The clinic looked the same from the outside, a plain storefront, white signage, nothing to indicate what happened inside. She had driven past it twice on different occasions during those 3 weeks. Both times she had kept driving. Inside, the same odorless air, the same careful silence. Celis was waiting for her in room 7, which she suspected was not a coincidence. You still have it, he said. She put the coin on the table. I want to understand the process first. That's reasonable. He leaned back. The coin contains a biostructured data package. When it docks with your BioLink, it doesn't interface with your nervous system directly. It interfaces with the BioLink's translation layer. Your body reads the chemical and electromagnetic signatures the way it would read a complex environmental input. Light, temperature, pressure, scent analogs. The experiences. He chose his next word carefully. Atmospheric. You don't become a Vakari. You stand near the idea of one. How near? Near enough, he said, that most veterans describe feeling something they hadn't expected to feel. Which is what? Recognition, he said, not of the enemy of the other person. She hadn't expected that word, person. She picked up the coin. The process was simple, which felt like it should be more complicated. She settled back in the padded chair. Celis connected the coin to her BioLink port with a thin connector, the same motion as plugging a charger into a phone, and then he stepped back and said, just breathe, which she found slightly annoying, because breathing was something she was already doing. Then the room changed. It didn't change visually. The walls stayed silver white, the photograph stayed on the wall. The slight vibration of the building's climate system continued beneath her feet. But something shifted in the quality of the air, or not the air, exactly, something in her perception of the air, and she became aware, gradually and then all at once, of a presence. It was not a Vakari. It was not the enemy she had trained to kill, trained to read tactically, trained to see as a threat shape. It was something deeper and older than that, something that the war had covered over like snow over a landscape, and now the snow was briefly, incompletely clearing. She smelled something she could not name. It was green and electric and slightly mineral, like a forest after lightning, and underneath it there was something warmer. A low chemical signature that she realized with a start was grief. Not human grief. Not the kind that hollowed out a chest and leaked behind the eyes. Something larger and slower, a grief the size of a migration. A grief that carried thousands of individuals in it the way a river carries sediment, each particle separate, each particle part of the whole. She was crying before she knew she had started. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just 2 lines of wet on her face, like rain on glass, and her hands very still in her lap. The presence deepened. She felt the way a Vakari moved through space, not as threat geometry, not as the tactical assessment she had spent 11 years honing, but as a being in relationship with gravity, with light, with the particular temperature of a planet it had evolved on for 100,000 years before humanity had ever reached the stars. She felt the weight of that history the way you felt the weight of a mountain, not crushingly, just as a fact of the landscape, something that had been there long before her and would continue after. And she felt, very faintly, at the edges of the transmission, curiosity. Not the aggressive curiosity of intelligence gathering, The curiosity of a living thing confronting something it had never seen before. The specific, tentative, slightly afraid quality of wondering. She wondered if the Vakari who had been sampled had felt it too. That brief lightning strike of recognition when something alien turned out to be a mirror. The coin finished its transmission. The presence faded. The room came back to ordinary. Celis was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. "You're the third veteran this year to cry," he said quietly. The other two were men. For what that's worth. She wiped her face without apology. "How did they get this data?" she said. "The Vakari samples." He hesitated. "Tell me the honest version," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "There was a research program during the armistice. 14 months. A small team, mostly xenobiologists, embedded with a Vakari unit in the outer territories. Cultural exchange, officially. Biological sampling, practically. The Vakari participated voluntarily." He paused on that last word as if it still surprised him. "Some of them came to the human settlement, too. Let themselves be sampled. Let human researchers sit with them." He looked at the photograph on the wall. "We don't talk about that program much. It complicates the narrative." "The narrative about what?" "About what the war was," he said simply. "About who started it and what they wanted and what kind of thing they were." She sat with that. "What kind of thing were they?" she said. "The same kind of thing we are," Celis said. "Complicated, frightened, capable of tremendous cruelty and tremendous grace, and not fully in control of which one they expressed at any given moment." He paused. "Sound familiar?" She looked at the bent tulip in the photograph, the one leaning toward something off-frame. "I want to come back," she said. "I know," he said. She came back on a Monday, and then the following Friday, and then twice the week after that. Each session used a different coin, a different data package, different Vakari, different recorded moments, different emotional signatures compressed into something the human biolink could translate without breaking the receiver. Each time she sat in room 7 and breathed and let the presence arrive, she learned something new. The third session, she felt the Vakari equivalent of laughter. It was not auditory. Vakari vocalized in ranges that human unaugmented ears could only catch at the edges, but the chemical signature was unmistakable. A cascading release of something that felt like champagne bubbles in the bloodstream, effervescent and brief and connected to something shared. She laughed out loud without meaning to. The sound surprised her. The fourth session, she felt exhaustion, not the bone-deep exhaustion of combat, which she knew intimately, but something longer and stranger. The exhaustion of a species that had been fighting for generations, not because it wanted to, but because something had gone wrong at the beginning, and no one on either side had been able to find the mechanism to make it stop. A war that had become its own weather, its own climate, a fact of the universe rather than a choice. She recognized that exhaustion from the inside out. It was the same exhaustion she had been carrying since Minos Station, since Yusuf, since the day she had looked at a dying Vakari in the wreckage of a tunnel and seen, in its 3 eyes, something that looked startlingly like apology. She had never told anyone about that. She told Celis after the 4th session. He listened without moving, his hands quiet on the table. "I thought I was imagining it," she said. "I've thought that for 3 years. What does it change?" he said. "If you weren't imagining it," she considered. "Everything," she said, "and nothing. Because it doesn't bring Yusuf back. It doesn't change the body count. It doesn't make the 11 years mean something different." She was quiet for a moment. "But it means I wasn't wrong to feel what I felt. And I've been carrying the weight of being wrong about that for 3 years. Celis nodded slowly. "That's most of what this does," he said. "It doesn't repair anything structural. It just," he searched for the word, "it restores the evidence. The thing you knew that you were told not to trust." She nodded once sharply, the way soldiers nodded when they understood an order. Then she picked up the next coin. The 5th session was different from the others. She had noticed by this point that the other clients in the waiting room changed but maintained a consistency of type. Veterans, mostly, though not all uniformed. Some of them wore their histories in their bodies. The particular stillness of people trained to be still under fire. The eyes that tracked movement without appearing to. Others wore it differently, as an absence, a quality of careful blankness that she recognized as the civilian equivalent of the same thing. People who had lost someone in the war. People who had read the reports and seen the photographs and understood intellectually that something large had happened and were here trying to make it real in a way the photographs couldn't. The waiting room man with the tablet was there again. He'd been there 3 times now. She had begun to think of him as the reader because he was always reading something he wasn't actually reading. His eyes moved the way. Eyes moved when they were watching the middle distance, through a prop. On the 5th visit, he looked up when she came in, just for a second, then looked back at his tablet. It was the kind of non-greeting that contained a greeting. She understood it perfectly. She nodded once, in his direction, and sat down across the room, and they waited together in the odorless silence, which was now slightly less empty than it had been on the first day. Room 7. Celis, a coin she had not seen before. Different form factor, slightly heavier, the kind of weight that meant more data density. This one is from the Armistice Archive, Celis said. It's the only one we have from a senior class Vicari, what they called. He used a sound that was mostly consonant, low and clicking. Roughly translates as something between elder and rememberer. The one who holds the long memory. She looked at the coin. What did they remember? The first contact, he said. She was very still. Before the war, he said. The original encounter, our ships and theirs. The moment before either side understood what the other was. She picked up the coin. The presence that arrived was unlike any of the others. It was vast, not physically. Not in the sense of something large bearing down, but in the way that age was vast, or the ocean, or a fact that had been true longer than living memory. This Vicari had been alive for something equivalent to 80 human years at the time of sampling, and it carried in its biochemistry the residue of things it had witnessed across the span of those years like sediment carried by water. Layer on layer, compressed into character, she felt the memory, not her memory, not the human archive, but the Vicari's own chemical record of the moment, and it arrived not as images but as sensation, as the specific quality of attention the Vicari mind brought to a thing it had never seen before. A ship, a human ship, small by Vicari standards, running lights blinking in a pattern that was not a language but was clearly a pattern, which was to a Vicari mind almost the same thing. And the Vicari, then centuries younger, standing at a viewport equivalent on a vessel built to specs the human engineers who later captured and disassembled it could not entirely replicate, feeling something that had no human name but translated imperfectly as, they are trying to say something, not a weapon, not a threat shape, a voice. The Vicari memory held the next 10 minutes in precise detail, the chemical equivalent of a photograph. The way the Vicari commander had turned to the elder-to-be and said something in that clicking, tonal language that translated roughly as the difference between the word stop and the word wait. Not stop because danger, but wait because listening. The way the ship had held position. The way the human vessel's running lights had continued their uncertain, earnest, terrified, hopeful blinking. And then the signal that the elder Vicari had carried in its biochemistry for 80 years like a stone in a pocket. The moment when another Vicari, young and nervous, had fired anyway, not from malice, from fear. She sat in room 7 for a very long time after the transmission ended, and she did not cry this time. She felt something worse than tears, something quieter and more total, a settling of weight that she had not known she was holding above her head. Celis was watching her. They didn't want to fight, she said. Not a question. One of them did, he said, and that was enough. One of ours did too, she said. That's in the human records, the first response. A nervous pilot on the outer perimeter. She paused. Both sides had one frightened person with a weapon. Yes, he said. In 11 years, she said. Yes, she sat with the weight of it. The coin was cold now in her hand, its data spent. She thought about the first Vicari who had fired. She thought about the human pilot on the outer perimeter, whose name was listed in the official record as Specialist T. Oakes, who had received a posthumous commendation for bravery in the face of alien aggression and who had, according to the unclassified after-action filed 3 years after the fact, survived the first contact incident and spent the rest of the war in administrative postings on the outer rim, not quite right in the eyes, according to the people who served alongside him. She thought about Specialist T. Oakes, alone in his cockpit, looking at a Vicari ship he had never seen before, understanding that it could destroy him, not knowing what else it could do, choosing the only certainty available to a frightened person with a weapon. She thought about the Vicari who had done the same. She thought about how easily she could have been either of them. What happened to the elder, she said. The one whose impression this is. Celis was quiet for a moment. Killed at Minos Station, he said. Year 9 of the war. She set the coin gently on the table, as if it were breakable. Minos Station, she said. Year 9. Yes. She looked at the bent tulip in the photograph on the wall. I was at Minos Station year 9, she said. My corporal died in the tunnel below the eastern grid. Celis said nothing. The Vicari who killed him, she said, were they? She stopped. She tried again. Was there a senior class Vicari unit in the eastern grid? I don't know the specific deployment, he said. I genuinely don't. She nodded. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. Same time Thursday, she said. Yes, he said. Same time Thursday. She walked out through the waiting room. The reader was gone. The chair where he'd been sitting held the shape of him for a moment. The faint impression of someone who had been there and then wasn't, and then that faded too, and it was just a chair. Outside, the rain had stopped. The freight yards across the road were quiet, the great articulated loaders standing still in the gray light like sleeping creatures, their silhouettes suggesting without quite achieving the shapes of Vakari when they rested, limbs folded inward, bodies low, the 6 points of them settling into stillness with a patience that was not peace but something like it. She stood on the wet sidewalk for a while and breathed the ordinary smell of rain-wet concrete and engine exhaust and the specific mineral quality of the city after water, and she thought about the elder Vakari carrying its stone for 80 years, and she thought about Specialist T. Oakes in his administrative posting, not quite right behind the eyes, carrying his. She walked to her car. She drove home. She did not look at Yusuf's photograph that night. She looked at the wall beside it instead. Just the wall, the plain painted surface of it, which held nothing and asked nothing, and did not lean toward anything off-frame. The Thursday session was the one where things changed. She arrived at the clinic to find the waiting room different. Not physically, same white walls, same odorless air, same chairs arranged in their careful angles. But the quality of the people in it had shifted. More of them. 7, where there were usually 2 or 3. And something in their posture that she read without thinking about it, the posture of people who were waiting for a specific thing and were not sure the thing was coming. The reader was there. He looked up when she came in and this time held her gaze for a second before looking away. Not evasion, not dismissal, but the particular look of a person who has something to say and has not yet decided whether to say it. She sat down next to him. She had never done that before. He glanced at her, then back at his tablet. "3rd time you've been here when I've been here," she said quietly. "4th, he said. He had a low, precise voice, the kind that had learned to be quiet in spaces where quiet mattered. "Combat vet? Civilian analyst," he said. "Mino Station Zone 3. I was in the transit station when the Eastern Grid went." He paused. "I was supposed to be in the Eastern Grid." She absorbed that. "Administrative delay," he said. 43 minutes. The briefing ran long. He turned a page on his tablet without reading it. "I've been trying to understand for 3 years why that matters. Does it?" He thought about it. "It feels like it should," he said. "Either it does and I have to figure out why, or it doesn't and I have to figure out how to put it down." She nodded. "I was in the Eastern Grid," she said. "My corporal didn't come out." He looked at her then, fully without the peripheral careful cataloging, just looked at her. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know," she said. They sat quietly for a moment. Around them, the other clients shifted, rustled, held their careful postures. "What's the thing you're trying to understand?" she said. From the sessions, he thought about it. Whether they were worth grieving, he said. The Vakari. He said it plainly, without apology, without the defensive register of someone expecting to be challenged. "I know that sounds wrong." "It doesn't," she said. "I've been angry at them for 3 years," he said. "And then I had the first session and I felt," he stopped, tried again. "I felt something in the data that I didn't expect." "Grief," she said. He looked at her. "You felt it too." "3rd session," she said. "4th for me," he said. I held out longer. A small, brief thing crossed his face that might, in a different situation, have been a smile. "I'm stubborn." "Me too," she said. From inside the clinic, from somewhere past the interior door, she heard voices, not raised, not alarmed, but serious in the register of people discussing something that mattered. Celis appeared at the interior door, slightly less composed than usual. He looked around the waiting room and found her. "Sergeant Morrow," he said. "I was hoping you'd be here. Can you come through?" She stood. The reader looked at her. "I'll be here when you come out," he said. She wasn't sure if it was a question or a fact. She decided it was a fact, which felt right. She followed Celis through the interior door past the numbered rooms, 5, 6, 7, and through a second door she had not noticed before, into a room at the back of the clinic that was not like the consultation rooms at all. It was larger. It had the quality of a working space, actual working space, not the carefully designed calm of the consultation rooms. Banks of equipment along one wall, the kind of biometric data storage and processing system she recognized from military applications, though configured differently, scaled differently. A woman she hadn't seen before stood at one of the banks, her back to the door, and when she turned, Morrow saw that she was very young and very frightened and trying extremely hard not to show either. "This is Dr. Yoon," Celis said. "She runs the data archive." "Something's happened," Morrow said. Not a question. "We received a transmission this morning," Celis said, "from outside the Kepler system." He paused. "From Vakari." The room was very quiet. "The armistice has been in holding pattern for 14 months, Celis said. "The negotiators have been," he chose his words, "moving carefully." The Vicari delegation has a specific demand on the table that the Human Council has not been able to bring itself to meet. He paused again. They want to be understood. Morrow stood very still. Not acknowledged, Celis said. Not diplomatically recognized in the formal sense. They want. He looked at Dr. Yoon, who nodded slightly. They want a human to receive the long memory archive. The full Vicari cultural record. From the first contact through the present. The elder impressions, the grief archives, the history as they hold it. He stopped. They believe that if one human being receives the full record, holds it, is witnessed to have held it, that constitutes understanding in the Vicari sense. A fundamental act of recognition that their delegation can bring back to their people as evidence that the piece is real. Morrow looked at the equipment banks. She looked at Celis. She looked at the bent tulip on the wall of room 7, which was visible through the open door, the one leaning towards something off-frame. How much data, she said. 80 years of elder-class Vicari experience, Dr. Yoon said. Her voice was steady despite the fear behind her eyes. Compressed and adapted for biolink transmission. We've run the projections. She paused. It's possible. Physically possible. The biolink can handle it in stages. It would take, she checked something on her screen, approximately 8 hours. Maybe 9. What does hold it mean? Morrow said. At what happens to a person who's received 80 years of Vicari elder memory, Doctor? Yoon glanced at Celis. We don't know, Celis said. We've never done it. The individual sessions you've had, a few minutes of single impression data. This would be orders of magnitude more. He was honest about it, which she appreciated even as it frightened her. It would be unlike anything we have data for. And why me, she said. Because you've been here 8 times, Celis said. Because you feel it rather than processing it. Because of what you told me after the Minos station transmission, he paused. And because the Vicari delegation specifically requested a first contact theater veteran who survived the eastern grid at Minos station. She was very still. They know about Minos station, she said. They were there, he said quietly. The delegation includes a Vicari who served in the eastern grid year 9. He let that land. They're not asking you to forgive them. They're asking you to receive what they were. She thought about Specialist T. Oakes, not quite right behind the eyes, in his administrative posting on the outer rim. She thought about one frightened person with a weapon. She thought about the elder Vicari carrying its stone for 80 years, standing at a viewport watching human running lights blink in a pattern that was not a language but was clearly a pattern. She thought about Yusuf, not the way he had died, but the way he had laughed deep and genuine and from somewhere that had no tactical application, in the light of a sun on a planet she could not name in front of witnesses. She thought, he would have been here before me. He would have been here on the first week. He would not have needed 8 sessions to get to this room. She thought, this is what I am here for. All right, she said, tell me the process. The process took the rest of the day to set up. She called no one. There was no one to call who would understand what she was doing, and she found that she did not want to try to explain it in terms that would require her to defend it. She was not defending it. She was doing it because it was the correct thing to do, and because she was the correct person, and because underneath all of that, she was doing it because she was tired of carrying the weight of incomplete understanding like a stone in a pocket, and because the elder Vicari had carried its stone for 80 years, and she felt that was long enough for both of them. She went back out to the waiting room first. The reader was there. He looked up. Something came up, she said. I'm going to be inside for the rest of the day. He studied her face. Is it bad? I don't think so, she said. I think it's important. He nodded slowly, the way she had nodded after the 4th session. Sharp and understanding, the nod that said, order received. I'll be here, he said, when you come out. She nodded back once and went through the interior door. Dr. Yoon had reconfigured the equipment room. The padded chair from room 7 had been brought in, which she appreciated. The specific comfort of the familiar in an unfamiliar situation. The biolink setup was more complex than the single coin configuration. A data relay system, multiple staged coin equivalents in a sequence chain, the whole apparatus calibrated to her specific biolink parameters. Celis reviewed the process with her one more time. She listened with the part of her mind that processed protocol, the part that had kept her alive in 11 years of war, and with another, quieter part that was not processing at all but simply present. You can stop at any time, Celis said. The relay will disengage immediately on your command. I know, she said. I won't stop. You don't know that yet. No, she agreed. I don't. But I know myself. She looked at him steadily. Start it. The first stage arrived gently, the same atmospheric quality as the single coin sessions, presence rather than pressure. She breathed through it. 30 minutes of early Vicari memory. The long grasslands of the Vicari home system. the chemical signatures of a world that was beautiful in ways her visual cortex would never fully translate, but her deeper biology could receive as something like music, not melody, but the condition that made melody possible. The second stage brought more. A Vakari elder in childhood, the equivalent strange and familiar at once. Learning a language that was 70% chemical and 30% vibrational. Learning to navigate space not as a grid, but as a relationship between objects. Learning, very young, that the universe was full of things that had never been seen before and that this was not a threat but a gift until. She held on to that until like a handhold. The third stage was harder. War. Not her war, an earlier Vakari war, one that had happened 200 years before the first contact, a territorial conflict with another species entirely, one she had never heard of, and whose name was a series of clicks she could not reproduce. She felt the Vakari equivalent of soldiers dying, not the individual deaths, which would have destroyed her, but the shape of mass loss, the way a community biochemically encoded grief when the people it had loved did not come back. She recognized the shape of it. She had learned its human equivalent in 11 years. She put her hand flat on her own thigh and pressed down, the way she had pressed down on wounded soldiers when the pressure mattered, and breathed and continued. The fourth stage was the first contact. She had felt a version of this before, the young elder at the viewport, the running lights, the moment before the shot, but this was the full record. Every witness account, every biochemical impression from every Vakari who had been there, and it arrived not as a single memory but as a chorus. Dozens of voices saying the same thing from different angles, and what they said was, "We did not know what you were, and we were afraid, and one of us let the fear win, and we have been sorry for it ever since." Across 200 years of memory, passed from elder to elder like a stone in a pocket, this specific sorry that could not be put down until someone received it. She was crying again. Both hands flat on her thighs, pressing down, the way she had learned to stay in her body when her body wanted to go somewhere else. Breathing, present. The fifth stage was the war as the Vakari lived it, not the tactics, not the military record, the living of it, the way their communities reorganized around the absence of those lost, the chemical encoding of missing persons in the community's collective biochemistry, the thing that was not quite prayer but served the same function. A regular renewal of the fact that someone had existed and mattered. She felt embedded in the fifth stage data, a specific impression she had not expected. A Vakari in a tunnel, Year 9, Mino Station. It was not the elder whose archive she was receiving. That Vakari had died in this same year, this same engagement. This was a different impression, gathered after the fact from a survivor who had been there. The survivor Vakari's biochemical record of the tunnel fight was shot through with the same grief shape she had felt in the third session, mass grief, the shape of loss, but there was something else in it too. Something smaller and more specific, the chemical equivalent of a face remembered. A human face. She thought Yusuf. She did not know, could not know. The data was not that precise, whether it was him specifically. But it was a human soldier, remembered by a Vakari survivor, held in a biochemical impression with the specific quality the Vakari equivalent of memory gave to things that mattered. Not to enemy combatants, not to tactical categories, to individuals, people who had been real. She pressed her hands down harder and breathed through it. The sixth and seventh stages blurred together in a long continuum, the armistice years, the gradual biochemical changes in Vakari collective memory as the war receded, and the grief settled into something that could coexist with something else, something she translated, imprecisely but not wrongly, as hope. The hope of a species that had seen enough of violence to know what violence cost and wanted, with an intensity that was almost evolutionary, to try something different. The eighth stage was the compilation the delegation had created specifically for this transmission. Not a historical record, a present-tense communication, the biochemical equivalent of a letter. It said, in the way that only chemistry can say things, below the level of language, at the level of the body itself, the molecular truth before it becomes words. We were something. We are something. We were here before you knew us, and we are here still, and this is what it was like. And then, at the very end, something she had not been prepared for. A smell, specific, unmistakable, green and electric and slightly mineral, like a forest after lightning, and she recognized it because she had felt it on her very first session, the beginning of everything, the thing that had made her cry before she knew she had started. The elder's grief, the migration grief, the river of loss carrying thousands of individuals, but different now. Changed, still a river, still carrying sediment, still enormous, but moving differently. The way a river moved when it reached the sea. Not grief anymore. Or not only grief. She sat in the equipment room for a long time after the transmission ended. She could not immediately tell how long. Her leg ached. Her hands were still flat on her thighs. The room smelled faintly of her own tears and the mineral quality of the Vakari data and the specific, clean, sharp smell of the BioLink equipment. She felt very large and very small and very still. Like she was carrying something that was not entirely hers, but had been given to her, deliberately, by something that had needed to give it. Celis was there. He had been there the whole time, she realized, sitting across from her, not touching, not speaking, just present. He had the look of a man who had witnessed something and was not sure what to do with the fact of having witnessed it. "Done," she said. Her voice sounded like her own, which surprised her slightly. "Done," he said. She sat up straighter, breathed, took inventory of herself the way she had been trained to. Status check, systems check. Is anything broken? Nothing was broken. Something was different, but different was not the same as broken. "The delegation," she said. "They need confirmation. I'll send word." "How do they receive confirmation?" she said. "What counts as proof?" "BioLink transmission record," he said. "What you received, when, duration. It's cryptographically verifiable." She nodded. "Send it." She stood. Her leg ached. Same as always. The shape of absence in the muscle that had grown back. She walked to the door of the equipment room and then turned back. "The Vakari in the delegation," she said. "The one who served in the Eastern Grid at Mino Station." "Yes, I want to meet them," she said. Celis was very still. "That would be," he paused. "That's not a small thing." "No," she agreed. "It's not. I'd have to go through the diplomatic channels. The council would want to." "I know," she said. "Start the process, whatever it takes." She paused. "I'm not asking them to forgive me either. I'm asking to sit with them the way they asked me to sit with their history." She looked at him steadily. "That's what this is for, isn't it? That's what all of it was for." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "That's what it was for." She went out to the waiting room. It was empty except for the reader. He was sitting where she had left him, 8 hours later, his tablet in his hands, not reading it. He looked up when she came through the door. He saw her face. He didn't say anything for a moment. "Are you all right?" he said. "I'm changed," she said, "which I think is different." He studied her with that direct, careful look that she had learned, over 4 visits, was how he processed things, not to be unsettling, but because he was someone who believed in looking at things plainly. "What happened?" he said. "I received something," she said, "from the Vakari." She sat down in the chair next to him, the same chair as before. The whole of it, the long memory. He was very still. "How much of it did you get through?" he said. "All of it," she said. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face. Not surprise, exactly, but the particular adjustment of a person encountering something that reshapes a category. "What was it like?" he said. She thought about how to answer that. She thought about the tulip in the photograph, bent towards something off-frame. She thought about the elder at the viewport. She thought about Specialist T. Oakes carrying his stone. She thought about Yusuf, laughing, in the light of a sun on a planet she could not name. "It was like finding out something you already knew was true," she said. "And then finding out why it's true." She paused. "And then finding out that they know it too." He sat with that. "That's a lot to carry," he said. "It's not heavy," she said. "That's the thing. You'd think it would be heavy, but it's..." She searched for it. "It's like putting down something you've been carrying. The weight is gone." He looked at his hands for a moment. "Do you think," he said carefully, "that they grieve the way we grieve?" "No," she said. "They grieve differently, bigger and slower and in a different direction." She looked at the clinic door, the interior door, room 7, and the photograph of the bent tulip behind it. "But the grief goes somewhere. It moves. It doesn't stay the same thing forever." She paused. "I think that's what they wanted to show us, that they can let things move." He was quiet for a long time. "I want to do it," he said finally. "What you did? You'd have to talk to Celis," she said, "but I think, yes." She looked at him. "I think that's why you're here." He nodded. The tablet was still in his hands, still open to the page he hadn't been reading. "My name is Cole," he said. "I don't think I've told you that." "Morrow," she said. "Della." He nodded once, the sharp, understanding nod. Order received, which she hadn't expected from a civilian analyst, and which moved her briefly and quietly, the same way the 5th stage data had moved her. Recognition of something specific and real. "Same time Thursday," she said. "Thursday," he agreed. She stood and walked toward the clinic's front door. The glass was misted with the beginning of evening fog, and through it the freight yard across the road was softening into shapes and shadows. The great loaders going still, the day's work done. She put her hand on the door. Behind her, Cole said, "Morrow." She turned. "Thank you," he said, "for sitting down next to me." She looked at him for a moment. The reader, who had been reading something different than the words, who had come back 4 times and held out longer and was stubborn, who had been in Zone 3 when the Eastern Grid went because a briefing ran long, who had been carrying the weight of incompleteness for 3 years. The same as her but different, The same stone in a different pocket. You would have done it eventually, she said. Probably, he said, but you made it sooner. She pushed open the door and walked out into the evening. The fog had come in off the sea, or off what passed for sea on the Kepler side of the continent, the great gray stretch of the inland reservoir that everyone called the sea because it was close enough and they needed a word for it. The fog had the specific smell of water and elevation and the faint mineral quality she had learned, months ago in room 7, to associate with something larger than weather. She stood on the wet sidewalk and breathed it in. 8 hours ago, she had been a person carrying 11 years of incomplete understanding like a debt she didn't know how to pay down. Now she was a person carrying 80 years of someone else's memory, given to her deliberately, with the specific intention that she carry it well. She thought about the negotiating table wherever it was, some orbital station, some neutral platform between two fleets that were not fighting anymore, but not yet at peace. She thought about the Vakari delegation and what it had cost them to ask for this, to say, receive us all of what we were, and let that be enough to start. She thought, it is enough. She thought, I am going to meet them. She thought Yusuf would have wanted to be there. And then she thought, for the first time in 3 years, something that did not come after that, thought like a locked door. Instead, it opened, and so he is. In whatever way a person persists in the things they changed in the people who loved them, in the parts of a decision that are made from grief and from love and from the specific stubborn refusal to let the worst thing be the last thing. So, he is. She walked to her car. She did not think about the drive home. She drove on muscle memory through streets that were softening in the fog, past the freight yards and the neighborhoods with the cracked sidewalks, past the clean-lined new development where the city was trying to remember itself differently, past the intersection where the coffee shop was still open and lit warm against the gray. She parked on her street. She went upstairs. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, in the dark, before she turned on the light. Just standing in her apartment in the dark, the way you stood somewhere when you wanted to feel it as a real place, a place that contained you and was changed by containing you. She turned on the light. The photograph of her and Yusuf was on the wall. She had looked at the wall beside it for months, the blank surface that asked nothing and held nothing. She looked at the photograph now, directly, completely, without looking to the side. He was laughing. She was laughing. The sun of the planet she could not name in front of witnesses was doing what suns do, which is to say it was illuminating things. She stood in her kitchen and looked at her corporal laughing in the light of a foreign sun, and she let herself feel the full weight and warmth of it without flinching, without the locked door, without the 3 years of incomplete grief pressing down like structural damage. And then she went to her desk and opened her comm system and began composing the message to the diplomatic council requesting formal access to the Vakari delegation and specifically to the member who had served in the Eastern Grid at Mino Station, Year 9. The message was straightforward. She did not dress it up or diminish it. She said, I have received the Vakari long memory archive in full. I am a first contact theater veteran, Eastern Grid, Mino Station. I am requesting a direct meeting, not as a diplomatic formality, but as the next necessary step in whatever this is. I am not asking for resolution. I am asking to sit with someone in the way that sitting with someone matters. She sent it. She made coffee hot, this time, and sat at the kitchen table with it. The way she had sat with the cold cup 3 weeks ago, and looked at the coin that she had been carrying as evidence that something had actually happened to her. On the table now, next to the coffee, was nothing. The coin was spent. The evidence was not something she needed to hold in her hand anymore. 3 days later, the diplomatic council responded. The response was formal and slightly startled in the way that formal things were when something moved faster than the machinery expected. It said that her request had been forwarded to the Vakari delegation, that the delegation had responded within 6 hours unprecedented speed 4 diplomatic channels, and that a meeting had been approved at the orbital station designated as the Armistice Platform. The meeting was set for 12 days from now. She read the message once, carefully, and then set it aside and called Celis. They said yes, she said. I heard, he said. The council told me this morning. What do I need to know, she said. To be ready. He was quiet for a moment. Everything you already know, he said. What you received, what it felt like, what it meant. He paused. You don't need to prepare a speech. You need to bring what you already have. The Vakari who was in the Eastern Grid, she said. Do you know their name? He used the clicking, tonal sound, the same kind of sound as the word for elder rememberer. It translates roughly as the one who stayed after. She sat with that. They stayed, she said, after the Eastern Grid. According to the archive, he said, yes. In the Vakari account after the tunnel engagement, When the human unit withdrew to the Western Junction, the Vakari unit also retreated. But one of them stayed for approximately 4 hours at the site of the engagement. He paused. The archive records it as a grief vigil. The Vakari practice of staying at the site of loss to formally witness it before leaving. Mara was very still. 4 hours, she said. Yes. Yusuf died in that tunnel, she said. His body was in the eastern grid for. She stopped. Did the calculation. We couldn't extract until the Western Junction was secured. That took. Her voice was very even. That took approximately 4 hours. Celis said nothing. They were with him, she said. They were with him after. I believe so, Celis said very quietly. She closed her eyes. Not in pain. Or not only in pain. In the specific way that you closed your eyes when something that had been wrong in the structure of a long story suddenly resolved when the missing piece arrived and the shape of everything changed. Tell them, she said. When you communicate with the delegation, tell them. She stopped again. There was a word in the Vakari archive, the 5th stage, the community biochemical encoding of missing persons. The renewal of the fact that someone had existed and mattered. She could not produce the sound, but she knew what it meant, and she trusted that the delegation would understand what she meant by reaching for it. Tell them I know what they did, she said. Tell them I know what it means. Tell them I'm coming. In the 12 days between the council's approval and her departure, she continued her sessions at the clinic. Not the archive sessions, those were done. The long memory received and settled in her, now the way sediment settled into riverbed, not blocking the water but becoming part of the channel. She went for the other clients, for the waiting room. She had not consciously decided to do this. She had simply arrived on the Tuesday, 4 days after the council's message, 8 days before the armistice platform, and found the waiting room with 6 people in it and sat down and waited, and Celis had appeared at the door of room 7 and given her a look of mild, genuine surprise. No session today, she said. Just. She gestured at the room. He understood. He nodded once and went back inside. The reader, Cole, was there. He had his 3rd session that Tuesday and came out of room 7 slightly undone in the way she recognized from her own 3rd session, the session where the grief shape arrived. He sat down 2 chairs from her and stared at his hands for a while. She waited. It's bigger than I thought, he said eventually. Yes, she said, the grief. He turned his hands over, looking at the palms. It goes further back than the war, it goes. He stopped. 200 years, she said. There was a war before ours, with another species. The Vakari came to us already carrying it. He absorbed that. How many wars did they survive before they got to us, he said. I don't know, she said. The archive only goes back to what the elder witnessed. She paused, but the structure of the grief is old, practiced. They know what it looks like from the inside. That's not comforting, he said. No, she agreed, but it's real. That's better than comforting. He looked at her. You've changed, he said. Not an accusation, a plain observation, the analyst's habit of noting what was true. Yes, she said. Since the long memory session. Since before that, she said. Since the first time I sat in room 7 and cried without knowing why. She looked at the interior door. The session was just the end of it. The thing the rest was building toward. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what does it feel like after carrying it? She thought about that carefully. She owed him a careful answer because he was going to go through his own version of it. Not the long memory. That had been a specific request from the Vakari delegation. But his own path through the data, his own arriving at the room in the back. It feels like weight, she said finally, but a different kind of weight than before. Before, I was carrying the absence of understanding. That's a terrible weight because it's unstable. It shifts, it presses in different places. It doesn't have a shape you can balance. This is the weight of something present, something with form. She paused. You can carry something with form. You can put it down and pick it up deliberately. The other kind you can't put down because you don't know what you're holding. He considered that for a long time. One of the other clients left. A new one came in, a woman Morrow hadn't seen before, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone who had made a significant decision about coming here and was still in the process of having made it. The thing you said, Cole said eventually, about Yusuf, she was still. You said he would have been here on the first week. He was careful with her name, had been careful with it from the moment she'd given it to him, using it rarely, and when he did with a weight that indicated he had thought about saying it first. You said he would not have needed 8 sessions. No, she said. He wouldn't. That tells me something about him, Cole said. What kind of person he was. Yes, she said, it does. Tell me about him, Cole said. Not about how he died, just who he was. She was quiet for a moment. No one had asked her that in 3 years. The people who asked about Yusuf always asked about the tunnel. What happened, how it happened, was it quick? And she had answered those questions accurately and without additional detail because the answers did not contain Yusuf. The tunnel did not contain Yusuf. Yusuf had been someone who existed before the tunnel and would have gone on existing after it if the tunnel had not been what it was. And the questions people asked had always been about the tunnel and not about the person. And she had stopped being able to explain the difference between those two things. Cole was asking about the person. He was funny, she said. Not the way soldiers are usually funny, not the gallows humor, not the deflection. He was just genuinely funny, the kind of person who found things amusing that other people missed and said so. And you'd think about what he'd said later and laugh again. She looked at her hands. He could read a situation in about 4 seconds and know what everyone in it needed. Not what they wanted, what they needed. It made him very good in the field, and it made him. She stopped for a moment. It made him the kind of person you want to be around. Not because he was always cheerful, because he was always honest about what was actually happening, and somehow that made it better rather than worse. Cole was listening the way the best analysts listen, fully, without performing listening. He argued with me constantly about protocol, she said. Not about orders, not about tactics, about protocol. The small bureaucratic requirements that existed for administrative reasons and served no operational purpose. He found every single one of them absurd, and he was right about approximately 70% of them. She almost smiled. He was right about the other 30% too, but I couldn't tell him that because it would have gotten worse. What would he have done in that room, Cole said. The long memory session. She thought about it. Really thought about it. The specific Yusuf answer. He would have been quiet during it, she said. And then afterward, he would have said something so accurate and so simple about what it felt like that it would have taken me a week to realize how much it contained. She paused. He had that quality. The right thing, said simply. And then he'd move on as if he hadn't just said something that was going to stay with you. Cole nodded slowly. I had a colleague like that, he said. In Zone 3. Civilian contractor, she was. He stopped and corrected himself. She is. She moved after the war. Different system. He paused. I haven't contacted her in 2 years. I kept thinking I'd have something better to say when I'd processed more of it. You'll never have something better to say, Morrow said. You'll just have something. He looked at her. Contact her, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said, I know. She stayed in the waiting room for another hour. The woman who had arrived with the careful deliberateness went through her session and came out pink-faced and slightly stunned, which Morrow recognized as the first session response, the atmospheric presence arriving as something you had no framework for. She got a glass of water from the small table near the door and sat down and stared at nothing for a while, and Morrow did not say anything to her, because sometimes silence was the right response to being stunned, and the room held it for her. When she left the clinic that evening, Cole walked out alongside her. It was the first time they'd done that. Always before, she had been leaving while he was waiting, or vice versa. Now they walked out through the glass door into the damp evening air together, which felt significant in the small, ordinary way that ordinary things were significant when you had been paying attention. You're going somewhere, he said. It wasn't quite a question. He'd read something in her posture, the particular readiness that preceded departure. Armistice platform, she said. 8 days. He stopped walking. She took another step and then turned to look at him. To meet the delegation, he said. One member of it, she said, the one who was in the eastern grid. He was very still for a moment, the analyst's stillness, processing something quickly. Are you afraid, he said. Yes, she said, but not of them. What then? She thought about it. Of getting it wrong, she said. Of going with the right intention and the wrong language and the communication failing in the translation and them thinking I don't. She stopped. The translator box only does approximate, and some things need to be exact, Cole considered. The BioLink does better, he said. For the emotional register. Yes, but I can't take the clinic equipment on a shuttle. He thought for another moment. What's the most important thing, he said, that you want them to know? If the translation fails completely, if there were no words at all. She thought about the 5th stage of the long memory, the grief share. The biochemical cascade, gold shading to white, the Vakari practice of saying, your grief is held alongside ours. You are not carrying this alone. That we are not carrying it alone, she said. Either of us. Cole nodded. That's exact, he said. Whatever language you say it in, that's exact. Say that. He paused. You'll get the rest across. She looked at him for a moment, the reader, the analyst, the person who had been in Zone 3 when the Eastern Grid went, because a briefing ran 43 minutes long, who had been sitting in the waiting room 4 times carrying the weight of surviving and trying to understand whether that mattered. You've gotten better, she said, at being right. He almost smiled. Practiced, he said. She walked to her car. Behind her, she heard him take out his comm, heard the soft click of it opening to a contact screen, heard him begin to compose something. She did not look back. It was his thing to do, and it was between him and whoever he was writing to, and she had done her part of it. 8 days later, she flew to the Armistice platform. The shuttle was small, a diplomatic transit vehicle, 8 passenger seats, 4 of them occupied. The other 3 passengers were council staff. One of them a senior diplomatic advisor named Karen Voss, who had been part of the armistice negotiations from the first week and who had the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been saying the same important thing to different rooms of people for 14 months without resolution. Voss spent the first 2 hours of the transit reviewing documents on a large display she had extended across her seat tray. Morrow watched the stars out the window and did not review anything. There was nothing left to review. In the 3rd hour, Voss looked up from her documents and across at Morrow. "You received the full archive," Voss said. "Yes," Morrow said. "How long did it take?" 8 hours and 40 minutes, Morrow said. Voss absorbed that. What was the... She paused, choosing carefully. What was the dominant thing, emotionally? Morrow thought about it. Recognition, she said. Of something I already knew but hadn't been given permission to know. Voss was quiet for a moment. "What were you told about the first contact incident?" she said. "In your service briefings." "Vakari aggression," Morrow said, unprovoked. She paused. "That's the official record." "Yes," Voss said. "There was a Vakari in the archive," Morrow said, "who carried the first contact as a griefstone for 80 years. The moment of the shot, the first shot. Vakari to human, the biochemical record of that moment is one frightened person with a weapon." She looked at Voss steadily. "Same as ours. The human pilot who responded. Specialist T. Oakes." Voss looked at her for a long moment. "The council has access to that information," she said. "The declassified version of the first contact after action. They've had it for 6 years." "They read it?" Morrow said. Voss was quiet for a moment that answered the question. "That's the problem," Morrow said. "Not the information, the receiving of it." She looked back at the stars. The Vakari understood that. That's why they built the archive. Not to tell us facts. To give us the experience of knowing something from the inside. She paused. "The peace won't hold if the council treats it as a political settlement. It'll hold if enough people receive what I received, feel what I felt, and then bring that into the rooms where decisions are made." Voss looked at her document screen, which had gone dim from inactivity. "That's going to take a long time," Voss said. "Yes," Morrow said. "But the Vakari have been waiting since the first contact. They know what long time looks like." The stars moved past. "Can I ask what you're planning to say to them?" Voss said. "In the meeting." "I'm going to say that we're not carrying it alone," Morrow said. "Either of us." She paused. "And then I'm going to ask them what comes next." Voss looked at her for a moment. "Do you know what comes next?" "Not specifically," Morrow said. "But I know the shape of it." She turned from the window and looked at the diplomatic advisor with the 14 months of exhaustion in her eyes. More receiving. More people sitting in white rooms learning how to feel something they've been told not to feel. More of the work that Celis's clinic does, but scaled, across the system, across both sides of the border. An archive project, a long memory exchange. She paused. "The Vakari don't need a treaty. They need a witness. And we need the same thing." Voss studied her. "You've become a diplomatic asset," she said. It was not quite a compliment, not quite an observation. Something between. "I became a person who went to a clinic 8 times. Morrow said, and sat in a chair and received something I was afraid to receive. She looked at Voss directly. "Anyone can do that. The scale of it is just a logistical problem." Voss looked back at her document screen for a long moment. Then she opened a new document and began to type something different from what she had been typing before. Morrow turned back to the stars. She thought about the clinic's waiting room, the odorless white silence of it, the chairs arranged in their careful angles, the people who arrived there carrying stones in their pockets. She thought about the woman who had come in with the careful deliberateness of someone who had made a significant decision. She thought about all the people who had not yet made that decision, were still sitting with the weight of incomplete grief and the locked door and the instruction not to trust what they had felt, all the specialist T. Oakes equivalents in their administrative postings on the outer rim, not quite right behind the eyes. She thought about what it would look like scaled up. Not one clinic, hundreds. Not one Vakari archive, an ongoing exchange. Not one first contact theater veteran sitting alone in room 7 learning to cry for the right reasons, thousands of them. And then eventually, people who had not been in the war at all, for whom the war was already history, learning to receive the memory of it from both sides before the incomplete grief of it had time to calcify into something harder. She thought about what that would require. She thought about what it would cost, politically and economically, and in the simple human currency of courage that it took to sit in a chair and receive something you were afraid of. She thought, it is still worth it. More worth it than the war was worth it, which was not worth it at all. Outside the window, the armistice platform came into view, a white ring in the dark, modest and deliberate, equidistant and careful. The most intentional dot of light in the field of unself-conscious stars. She watched it grow as they approached. She put her hand on the glass, not quite touching, just close. The cold bled through the thin air gap. The platform grew slowly and then faster, the ring resolving into structure, the structure resolving into detail, docking arms, habitat rings, the small precise shapes of two different kinds of ship moored at two different kinds of berth. Human and Vakari, 10 meters apart, engines dark, waiting. She took her hand from the glass, she breathed. She was ready. She flew to the armistice platform on a clear morning, which felt appropriate, though she acknowledged to herself that she was assigning significance to weather in the way of someone who needed the world to cooperate with the significance of what they were doing. The platform was a modest facility. Deliberately so, she thought. The modesty of it was political. A statement about not claiming too much, not building a monument before anything had been decided. It occupied a stable orbital position between the inner system and the outer territories, equidistant from human-claimed space and the Vakari approach vectors, which was a calculation so precisely symbolic that she imagined the negotiations over its positioning had been extremely tedious. She was met at the docking collar by a diplomatic attaché who was very young and very precise, and who briefed her on protocol in the transit tube with the speed of someone who had briefed many people and was aware that most of them were not listening as carefully as they appeared to be. She was listening carefully. The Vakari used chemical protocols for formal meetings, not unlike what the BioLink transmitted, but direct rather than mediated. The exobiological equivalent of a handshake or a bow, a chemical introduction that said, I acknowledge you, I am present with you, I intend to be honest with you. She would not be able to produce the Vakari chemical signal. The attaché explained that a translated equivalent would be administered before entry, small patch on the wrist that would release a simple chemical acknowledgement that the Vakari would read, and that the Vakari would acknowledge in return with their own signal, and that she would not be able to fully interpret, but would feel as an atmospheric presence, not unlike the early sessions at the clinic. She rolled up her sleeve without being asked and let the attaché apply the patch. Ready? The attaché said. Yes, she said. The meeting room was white-walled and cool and smelled of nothing, which she recognized as the same considered blankness as the waiting room at Celise's clinic, a space built to be neutral, to ask nothing of the people in it except presence. There was a low table. On her side, a chair calibrated human dimensions. On the other side, a broader, lower configuration. Not a chair, more like a shallow contoured surface, built for a body that distributed its weight differently. The Vakari was already in the room. She had seen Vakari many times. She had fought them. She had studied them tactically. She had received 80 years of their elders' memory through a BioLink in a clinic on Kepler City's east side. She had believed, coming through the door, that she was prepared. She was not fully prepared. This was not about size or appearance. She had processed both, intellectually. It was about presence. The Vakari in the tunnel, the Vakari in her targeting reticle, the Vakari as a tactical fact of the universe. All of those were the enemy, which was a category that simplified everything. This Vakari, sitting in a room and looking at her with three eyes arranged in a triangle on a face that moved in ways human faces did not, was not a category. It was a person. She had known that. She had received the knowledge of it 8 hours at a time in room 7. But knowing and standing 3 meters from it were different things, and she stood in the doorway for exactly 2 seconds, breathing, before she walked forward to the table and sat down. The Vakari's eyes tracked her movement, all three. The bioluminescent throat sac, dark now, the bioluminescence suppressed, which she had learned from the archive was the Vakari equivalent of lowered eyes, a gesture of non-aggression, of meeting someone at their own level, pulsed once faintly with a pale blue-white light. She felt the chemical acknowledgement arrive, the patch on her wrist warming slightly, and in the air of the room, a quality she recognized from the sessions, the presence of an entity encoding something for her reception, not the full depth of the archive sessions. A simpler signal, I am here, I see you. She set her hands flat on the table, palms down. She was not sure if this was a recognized gesture in Vakari protocol, and she had not been briefed on it, but it felt correct. Open hands, present, nothing held. The translator system was a box on the table between them, developed over 14 months of armistice negotiation. capable of approximate rendering of Vakari vocalization into human language and vice versa. The attaché had warned her that it was approximate. All translation was approximate. She said, "I received the long memory," the translator processed. The Vakari's throat sac pulsed once, twice, a rhythm she had learned to read as the Vakari equivalent of acknowledgement. The translator rendered the Vakari's response in a flat, precise tone, the inflection stripped by the machine to something manageable. "We know, we were told, we are grateful." She looked at the Vakari's 3 eyes. She had spent 11 years training herself not to do this, not to look at the thing in the face, because the face was where humanity crept in, where tactical objectivity broke down. She had unkept that training in 8 sessions in room 7. Now she looked. "I know what you did after the tunnel," she said. "The grief vigil. 4 hours. My corporal was there." The translation went across. The throat sac moved in a longer, more complex pattern, not the acknowledgement pulse, something deeper, slower. The translator rendered. "He was not alone. We made certain," she breathed. "Thank you," she said, "for that." She was not sure the translator could render the fullness of what she meant by that. She was not sure any translator could. But the Vakari's eyes shifted, a triangular tightening of focus, 3 points of attention converging, and the throat sac produced a slow cascade of light pale gold shading to white, which she had learned in the 5th stage of the archive was the Vakari grief share signal, the biochemical release that communicated, "Your grief is received, it is held alongside ours, you are not carrying this alone." She felt it in the room, not through the biolink, not through the patch, just in the air. The quality of the air changing the way it had changed the very first time. In room 7 on the day she had decided to stop carrying the coin as evidence. She breathed. She sat with the Vakari for 3 hours. The translator box sat between them, doing its imperfect work. She told the Vakari about Yusuf, not his death but his laugh, the deep and genuine quality of it, the specific light on his face in the photograph she had finally looked at directly. The Vakari told her about the elder whose long memory she had received, about the 80 years of that particular stone in that particular pocket, about what it had meant to the elder's community when the elder had agreed to participate in the Armistice Archive project, to give the memory not as a weapon or a claim but as an offering. She told the Vakari about Specialist Teox, not quite right behind the eyes in his administrative posting, carrying the weight of being the human who fired first. The Vakari was quiet after the translation. "Then there is a Vakari name we do not say, the one who fired first on our side. We have carried that name in the same way you carry the other, as an accounting that does not resolve." A pause in the translation. "It would help to know that you also carry it, that the weight is shared." She thought about the balance scale. 1 frightened person on each side, and 11 years poured in after, and now 2 people in a room on a platform between 2 territories, sitting with the full weight of it and choosing, together, to put it down. "Shared," she said, "yes." The Vakari's throat sac lit in the cascade again, golden white, slow and long, the full grief share. And she felt it land in her chest the way things landed when they were real, when they counted. When she came back through the docking collar into the shuttle bay, the Achak was waiting. His expression was carefully neutral, which she had learned was what carefully neutral looked like on someone who understood that something significant had occurred and did not know what the correct response was. She said, "Tell the council the meeting was successful." "Do you have anything more specific for the report?" he said. She thought about it. "Tell them," she said, "that the Vakari can be grieved for, that they grieve for us, and that knowing that changes what the piece is based on." She paused. "Tell them it's based on something real now." She took a window seat on the shuttle back to the inner system and watched the platform recede. The white habitat ring, the docking arms, the small, careful shape of a place where something had been built between 2 species out of loss and stubbornness, and the specific human refusal to remain incomplete. She took out her comm and composed a message to Cole. It said, "The meeting happened. I'll tell you about it Thursday." He replied within 4 minutes, "Thursday." She put the comm away. Voss was across the aisle, not looking at documents anymore, just looking out her own window, the dim reflection of her face overlaid on the moving dark. She had that particular stillness of a person who has begun to think about something differently than they thought about it before, and who was still in the early part of that process, the part where the new shape was not yet fully visible, but you could feel it arriving. Mara did not disturb it. She knew the feeling from the inside. She looked out her own window at the stars, which were the same stars they had always been, the same pattern, the same depths, unchanged by the war or the armistice or the meeting or any of the small real things that had happened in the foreground. The universe did not record what happened in it. The universe just continued. She continued in it. She thought about Celis, who would hear how the meeting went and would nod in that quiet way of his and then go back to his clinic in his room 7 and his carefully odorless waiting room, which she had told him, before she left for the platform, needed to smell like something, like coffee or rain, or something that told people who walked through the door that they were in a place where real things happened to real people. He had agreed. He'd said he would think about it. She thought about Dr. Yoon, young and frightened behind the eyes in the equipment room, who had calculated the projections and stood at her databank, and done the work that made it possible for a soldier to receive 80 years of alien memory in a padded chair in a clinic on the east side of Kepler City. She thought about the attaché on the platform, very young and very precise, who had applied the chemical acknowledgement patch to her wrist without ceremony and said ready, and accepted her answer without doubt, which was a small thing and a real one. She thought about the bent tulip in the photograph on the wall of room 7, the one leaning towards something, off frame, and she understood now, in the way you understood things after the fact, that the photographer had known, had seen the tulip leaning and pointed the camera at it, and known that the thing off frame was not absence but a direction, a lean towards something. The record of motion and intention, frozen just before arrival. She thought about Yusuf, not the way he had died, but the way he had laughed. Deep and genuine, and from somewhere that had no tactical application, in the light of a sun on a planet she could not name in front of witnesses. She thought. He would have been at the clinic on the first week. He would have been in the equipment room 3 sessions in. He would have been on this shuttle. She thought, this is what I am carrying forward. Not just the long memory of the elder who stayed in the field for 80 years. Not just the Vekri grief shape with its river weight and its direction. But Yusuf, who would have been here before her, who is here in whatever way a person persists in the decisions they make possible in the people who love them. She leaned her head against the window. The glass was cold. The stars were constant. The shuttle moved through them. She fell asleep watching the stars. She did not dream about the tunnel. She dreamed about a field of tulips, in light so clear it felt like the first light of the first morning of everything, and in the dream one of the tulips was bent towards something off-frame, leaning with its whole length toward whatever it was, and in the dream she knew what the thing was. It was the rest of the field, and the field was leaning back.